Well, it's good to see friends, old and new, here today as we come up on the 9/11 anniversary tomorrow. I was looking for the flyer there. What? Could you hand me the flyer? Something that struck me here earlier. 11 years after 9/11, what went wrong with American policy is the topic for our panel here today. And if you want an illustration of how bad things are, what's wrong with American policy, consider this. In May, we had a member of a designated terrorist organization flown into the United States at U.S. taxpayer expense, walked into the White House to have meetings with the National Security Council and demanded the release of their terrorist leader, the blind Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. And then, when the news came out, Eli Lake at the Daily Beast reported that this had happened, and Chairman Peter King from the House Homeland Security Committee was asking Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, about this. She said, yes, and we're going to let even more of them in. You know, there's some choice adjectives I could use, but that's how bad things are. They're walking terrorists into the White House. With Frank's presentation, we don't have to oversell this. You know, we don't have to engage in conspiracy theories. All we have to do is stick to the facts. So that's just what struck me as I was sitting here, and I kind of want to go over a couple points of what I think is wrong with our American policy. The first thing that I think we should take note of is the fact that we haven't had a successful major terrorist attack since 9/11. Successful. His put us in a state of complacency, I think. We've been extremely lucky, providentially so I believe, with the Times Square bombing, which the difference between an M88 and an M80 was all that stood between, you know, a failed attack and hundreds, possibly up to 1,000 dead in Times Square. Razor thin, the underwear bomber, where if he had just let the chemicals cure a little longer, he may have brought that plane down over Detroit, killing a couple hundred Americans. We've been extraordinarily lucky. This is not I think one of the things that hinders us is we think that this is a problem that's in Somalia. This is a problem that's in Yemen. This is a problem that's in Pakistan. This is not a faraway problem. It's happening right here. And that's one of the things that Peter King with the House Homeland Security Committee the hearings they've been holding into domestic radicalization have been getting into. My own personal story. On the morning of 9/11, I was getting ready for work in my apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. Well, I was 3 hours behind, you know, all of you here on the East Coast. My father had to call me from Ohio. He said, turn on the television. And as in the hours and the days that followed, lo and behold, four of the hijackers who were hijacked the American Airlines Flight 77 that flew into the Pentagon, which many of us drove by on our way in today, had lived and trained half a mile from my apartment in Scottsdale. Hani Hanjour had done his flight training at Scottsdale Airport, literally right down the road from my apartment. It's not a faraway problem. Here recently, I wrote an article about my neighbor in Hilliard, Ohio, Dr. Salah Sultan, one of the top Islamic scholars in the world, protege of Yusuf Qaradawi. And here recently, he's been palling around the Middle East with designated terrorists. And he posts pictures of this up on his Facebook page. And this is a guy who, up until a couple years ago, lived in my city. And the FBI had no idea who he was, that he was there. And After some intervention with some members of Congress, we were finally able, first off, to get his U.S. citizenship application scuttled. He was almost a U.S. citizen. And then get him banned from the United States. More recently, something that I was thinking about last night, and actually I brought my badge, back in February, the Center for Security Policy was having a Friday lunch in the Capitol Visitor Center, as they do on occasion. And I was in town, attended. I know some of us, Sarah, you were there. Some of the staff members were there. And I was sitting with Steve Coughlin, and we're having lunch, and suddenly everybody's BlackBerries start buzzing. And Steve leans over and says they caught a suicide bomber on the way to the Capitol, where we were at the time. And we walked in, when we walked in, went through security, there was no trouble. We walk out, and there are Capitol Police with M4s standing every 20 feet. And, we found out later that Amin El Khalifi, a illegal immigrant from Morocco, had what he believed to be an operational gun and a suicide belt, and he was on his way to the Capitol Visitor Center, where we were at the time. Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, was speaking at the lunch. And I kept...
He was not invited.
Yeah. But he certainly wanted to join the party.
He may have.
And I kept my Senate pass, and I keep it attached to my computer monitor just to remind me how close we came to danger. He came fully intending to kill people, including us. Which gets to my second point. We have not addressed the ideology institutionally that drives Islamic terrorism. Back several years ago, about 5 years ago, the big thing was TrueSpeak, which is a program. Well, you can't talk about jihad as violent warfare, even though that's exactly how they identify it in Islamic law. It's more internal yoga and things like that. And then that became official policy, and the National Counterterrorism Center put out a document, a lexicon of words that work. But there's no proof that those words actually work, because here we are years later, and we still have the exact same problem. It covered up the problem. It obscured the problem. It didn't illuminate it. And then about the same time as when we had in Foreign Policy magazine, or Foreign Affairs, the moderate Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood's moderate. And I was engaged in the debate publicly with the authors of that article, Robert Lakin and Stephen Brooke. And the result we see today is, now the Fort Hood massacre is called workplace violence. We see these, last month, the green on blue attacks, where our Afghan allies are killing American soldiers in Afghanistan. And we have General Allen, the commander of NATO troops, comes out publicly and says, well, it's because of Ramadan fasting in the Afghan heat. People are dying because of this. Americans are dying because of this blindness. And then we have institutionally that they're bearing this issue with the whole violent extremism narrative, whatever that might happen to be. Well, you believe something strongly, you might fight for it, like democracy, like the Founding Fathers did. Well, then you too might be a violent extremist. It's a completely nonsensical term, but you have entire government agencies now built off of this violent extremism. And then lo and behold, who do we find who are running these violent extremism task forces but the very people that Frank identified? Mohammed Majid, Mohammed El Ibiari, Dalia Moghahed. They were all on the Homeland Security Task Force for countering violent extremism. And it's not clear that they've ever countered a violent extremist before. which illustrates my third point. The institutional blindness is even worse than what we saw before 9/11. You know, we talk about a pre-9/11 mentality. I think we're back to an October 1979 mentality, where we just don't have a clue at what's headed toward us whatsoever. A great example of that, and Frank brought it up, is despite the evidence that was presented by federal prosecutors in the Holy Land Foundation trial about the Muslim Brotherhood network in America identifying individuals and organizations, what the United States government has done is what they say in federal court, they turn around and say exactly the opposite in every other setting. Oh, these are moderates, these are our friends and allies, these are our outreach partners. Yes, Kifa Mustafa, he was an unindicted co-conspirator, and yes, we have him on video singing, "I am a member of Hamas," but he's a valued FBI outreach partner for the Chicago field office. Again, we don't have to exaggerate. That actually happened. Frank talked about Louis Safi, the top Pentagon Islamic advisor, who's now the political director for the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. Anybody have a problem with that? Well, they're moderate after all. You know, they're a largely secular organization, if, you know, according to the Director of National Intelligence. Yeah. And whatever happened with that? February 2011. The Director of National Intelligence goes before the House Intel Committee and says that the Muslim Brotherhood is a largely secular organization. Now, he didn't pull this out of a hat. He was reading from a set of briefing notes prepared by the National Intelligence Council, which is the top assessment of our intelligence agencies. And they believed that the Muslim Brotherhood was a largely secular organization. Whatever happened with that? Whoever went back and said, how the hell did you arrive there? How did this happen? Well, that examination never happened. Recently, I wrote about, since we're here on Capitol Hill, Ghulam Nabi Fai, who operated here on Capitol Hill for 20 years as a peace advocate. Well, lo and behold, he's now in federal prison. Because he was for 20 years operating as an asset of the Pakistani intelligence ISI, the same group that birthed the Taliban. And, you know, he was having members of Congress come into settings like this, having peace conferences, you know, with Dan Burton, Republicans and Democrats alike. And he was involved with all of these organizations in leadership roles with all of the organizations that our U.S. government has designated as, in federal court, as Muslim Brotherhood fronts, but all in every other setting as their outreach partners. This is how confused and broken things are right now. Frank talked about Abdurrahman al-Amoudi and the problems with Republicans. Did anybody see the article in the New York Times over the weekend about George Bush, him going to the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. a couple days after 9/11, and how great a thing that was? Well, who was standing beside George Bush? Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, one of the top al-Qaeda fundraisers in America, who's currently in federal prison. Who was standing directly behind him but Nihad Awad, one of the top Hamas operatives in the United States, identified as such by the FBI and federal prosecutors in the Holy Land Foundation trial. Again, institutional blindness. My last point, this institutional blindness has led to the continuing of a reckless foreign policy that is increasing Islamic radicalization overseas and is turning the Middle East over to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, that's a fact. We only need to look at Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, where we had al-Qaeda members, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who we renditioned back to Libya as an Al-Qaeda, LIFG affiliate, and now he's one of the top political officials. He's formed his own political party in Libya. Al-Qaeda, who we put in power, might be running Libya soon. We see what's going on in Syria, and lo and behold, we have Louis Safi, who was involved with Muslim Brotherhood front groups right here, who had his offices raided, and now he pops up in Qatar as the head of the political division of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. That's a problem. The other thing we're seeing is we are seeing a continental-wide front of jihad opening up across the whole of Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya, Sudan, Mali, which was one of the most stable democracies in Africa, and it's now a Sharia state within a couple of months, completely off the radar of any of our intelligence agencies. How did that happen? Well, what happened was the Libyan arms, after we overthrew Gaddafi, those Libyan arms started funneling down to terrorist groups in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're seeing almost weekly violence in Nigeria targeting Christian churches. Hundreds have died this year, bombings of churches and assassinations, etc. And then the last two things that we see with this reckless foreign policy is alienating really the only true democracy in the Middle East, Israel, at the same time that we're aiding and abetting Iran. I would encourage you all to read Bill Keller's editorial in the New York Times today, where he makes the point, oh yes, you know, Iran getting nuclear weapons would be bad, but that wouldn't be near as bad as the Israelis actually doing something about it. We are in desperate times. I think more desperate than what any of us really realize. And most of us here are old enough to remember 1979, and some of the things that they're saying about the Muslim Brotherhood are the exact same things that they were saying about the Ayatollah Khomeini. Oh, power will moderate him. Well, how well did that work out? So, thank you all for being here. These are important issues with the anniversary tomorrow. We have to remind ourselves that that these things happened. You know, in biblical history, in biblical law, where the condemnations of people who would remove the markers, the historical markers, to deprive people of history and of memory. There were stern warnings about that. And that's why I think occasions such as this, where we had nearly 3,000 American citizens killed right here, that's something we need to remember. And we need to do everything that we can to prevent happening again. So thank you.